Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Are the wars we see today, from Gaza to Ukraine, a sign of decline of American influence and power in the world? Let's get to the bottom line. More than 7,000 Palestinians have been killed by nonstop Israeli bombing since the shock and awe attack of Hamas on October 7th, when about 1,400 Israelis were killed and about 200 others were taken hostage. The United Nations has been warning about a huge humanitarian catastrophe, with millions of people innocent in this conflict living under constant shelling with no food, electricity, water, medicine, or fuel to keep the hospitals and ambulances running. But the UN, which has lost about 30 of its own staff in Gaza, has so far been ineffective. U.S. President Joe Biden says he won't call for a ceasefire or otherwise interfere in Israeli military plans, even as fears mount for a wider conflict in the region. And in Eastern Europe, the Ukraine-Russian conflict grinds on, also with no end in sight. So what are today's raging conflicts telling us about shifting global power? Is America still a nation whose positions matter to the rest of the world, or is it leaving a power vacuum that's being filled by other forces? Today we're talking with Charles Kupchan, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, professor of international affairs at Georgetown University, and author of The End of the American Era, U.S. Foreign Policy and the Geopolitics of the 21st Century. Dr. Kupchan, thank you so much for joining us. This is a world and places in the world where American power used to matter. And I've just been reading your book again and wondering whether the contraction of America in the world is somehow creating these conditions.
You know, I think there are two big developments, Steve, that are making the world feel topsy-turvy, making the world feel like it's gone upside down. One of them I think we saw coming, and that is the diffusion of power, right? We used to live in a world dominated by the United States and its democratic partners that represented, say, 75% of global GDP. And we're now heading into a world in which power will be decentered, in which the number one power in the world within a decade or so will probably be China. India may be number two. Indonesia is climbing the ranks. Brazil getting stronger and stronger. And this is just leading to the return of rivalries that come with multiple centers of power. The other thing that's happened, and I think many of us did not see it coming, is the weakening of the liberal anchor of the global system, and in particular, the political weakening that we've seen here in the United States, with the political center in the United States hollowing out, with illiberal populism in rise in both sides of the Atlantic. And this, in some ways, hampers the ability of the United States and its partners to anchor this inevitable turn, this moment in which there is an inflection point, a shift in the global distribution of power to a much more multipolar, what you could call a polycentric world. So that these two things are combining to create a real sense of disorientation.
Within the Israel-Hamas conflict now, President Joe Biden has refused to call for a ceasefire, refused to say he's going to intervene in any way in what the Israelis are doing. We've also refused to call for a ceasefire in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. And I like Americans to have a realistic sense of how that's perceived around the world, and that there are other major powers, and I'll mention Turkey and Erdogan, see the world differently. And are we in a situation where America's lost the ability to be the great, hegemonic, benign power, and now other nations in the world are organizing against it as it picks one side or the other in these conflicts?
You know, I'd probably distinguish carefully between the war in Ukraine and what's happening in Israel, and the war that Israel is in the middle of carrying out against Hamas. In Ukraine, I think what we've seen is a situation in which Ukraine is suffering a bold act of aggression by Russia, and in which the United States and its allies have agreed to help Ukraine but don't have boots on the ground. And in the end of the day, the U.S. has said, this is Ukraine's war. Ukrainians are fighting and dying. Ukraine makes the final call about what its war aims are. And if the Ukrainians want to keep fighting and try to get back Crimea and try to get back every inch of Ukrainian territory, that's their right. But I do think that much of the global South is not taking sides, despite the fact that this is a bald act of aggression. And I think that is in many respects a consequence of a world in which many emerging powers are hedging, in which China is now the lender of first resort in much of the global South, in which 2/3 of the countries in the world trade more with China than they do with the United States. And so a country like India, like South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil, Indonesia, they don't want to take sides in what looks like a new era of East-West rivalry. And as a consequence, they're sitting on the fence, even though I think this is a war that is very clearly a war of aggression against Ukraine, in which countries, at least ethically and morally, should band together against Russia. In the case of Israel's war with Hamas, I think it's more complicated in the sense that the Israel-Palestine conflict is one in which there are diverging opinions about morality, about ethics, about legality, about human rights that have divided the United States and many other parts of the world for quite a long time. And I think that's what we're seeing play out here. I think given the nature of the atrocities that Hamas carried out on October 7, Israel is seen as having a right to defend itself and having a right to respond with force. How this conflict plays out, however, will have a big impact on how the rest of the world reacts, whether civilian casualties are kept to a minimum, whether aid flows in to Gaza in the form of fuel, medicine, food, whether we see an effort to arrive at some sort of reasonable peace process at the end of the conflict. Right now, we're in the middle of it. It's proving to be a very divisive, bloody, tragic event.
From your experience, do you think Israel can go through the steps it wants to do right now in destroying Hamas in the way it's doing it and not have this conflict grow far more significant in terms of numbers and scale?
Well, I think President Biden has got it more or less right and walked a fine line in the sense of supporting Israel, going to Israel in the middle of the conflict, providing military assistance to Israel, but at the same time being very explicit and saying, don't be blinded by rage. Don't make the same mistakes that the United States did after 9/11, where we intervened in Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and Syria, and in many respects produced much more chaos than stability. And I think it's a wise warning to Israel, because Israel is headed into a densely populated urban environment. Under the best of circumstances, there will be significant casualties on both sides. The United States learned the hard way in Iraq that military force is good at destroying things, but not very good at creating desired political outcomes. So I think that Israel right now is trying to figure out how to balance its desire, justified in my mind, to dismantle Hamas with the reality that it's going to be a tough war and it has to play the long game and figure out what Gaza will look like afterward, what its relationship with Palestinians and the broader Middle East will be like when the dust settles.
We have Wang Yi right now, as you and I are talking, in Washington, the foreign minister of China. He said he believes that Israel's actions have now gone beyond the level of self-defense and response. But is he, as you just said, essentially making a play to the global South and, again, taking advantage of this moment to maximize China's position of looking like the good player in the world?
You know, I think China is somewhat ambivalent about the war in Ukraine and now the war that we see in the Middle East. in the sense that the Chinese have risen to become a significant player on the back of geopolitical and geoeconomic stability. And even though they've sided with Putin and supported, at least nominally, Russia's war against Ukraine, I'm not sure that they see this as a net gain for China. And that's, again, because this is leading to global fragmentation. It is leading to economic decoupling, and it is intensifying China's rivalry with the United States and the West. But I think you're right, Steve, that what China is doing here is in some ways attempting to stay out of these conflicts, yet at the same time exploit them to increase its standing in the global South, to play the role of the country that's standing up to Western hegemony. And in some ways, I think it's irresponsible in doing so, because it is aiding and abetting Russia's aggression against Ukraine. And rather than trying to play a more constructive role in the Middle East, whether it's helping to negotiate the release of hostages, figuring out how to limit damage, getting humanitarian assistance into Gaza, it's attempting to, in some ways, exploit the issue to try to raise its profile in the global South. And in some ways, I think as a consequence, its position is going to further inflame the tensions that we see out there between the West, the United States on the one hand, China on the other.
Charlie, I want to play a sound clip for you from Secretary of State Tony Blinken. Let's listen.
Heat, water, electricity for children, for the elderly, for the sick. These are President Putin's new targets. He's hitting them hard. This brutalization of Ukraine's people is barbaric.
So I'm just sort of interested in, one, the hypocrisy of the moment, talking about these same devices being used to turn something off and are not being able to talk about it with regards to Israel, and then trying to help the other side, why their response has been so pathetically small.
Well, I think that the United States has made clear from the beginning that it has done its best to get the border crossing to Egypt open, to get aid flowing, has been discussing with Israel how it prosecutes this war. As we were speaking about a few minutes ago, Mr. Biden said very clearly, don't make the same mistakes we did. Don't be blinded by rage. So I think this is a work in progress. But given that the attacks on October 7 were over the top, were atrocities, now you have women, children, grandmothers kidnapped, being held hostage in Gaza, I think one can understand to some extent Israel's rage and Israel's response. But I do think that there is a middle ground here, and that involves a careful but strong military operation against Hamas leadership, against Hamas fighters, against the tunnels, the weapons depots, with, at the same time, efforts to protect civilians, to get food, fuel, water, medicine into Gaza so as to diminish and minimize the humanitarian emergency that is inevitably unfolding when Hamas decides to use its own Palestinian brethren as human shields.
I guess my question to you is about the tyranny of inertia and the vested interests that build up that don't want to see progress on these, fragile geostrategic hot points. Is that part of the game we have to accept, that we're always going to have certain nodes in the world that continually erupt like this?
Well, as my friend and colleague Richard Haas put it a few days ago, in the Middle East, things get worse before they get worse. And I think the message here is trying to build peace in the region, trying to get rapprochement between longstanding adversaries is very difficult business. I take my hat off to President Obama for trying to reset the relationship with Russia, for attempting to decrease the animosity with places like Iran and Cuba. And he did, to some extent, succeed, and to some extent, he didn't succeed. But I do think we have to keep trying. And Steve, we know from history that peace does break out, right? The French and the Germans were killing each other for centuries. You now drive from France to Germany and you see no border crossings. The United States has a relationship with its neighbors in which the prospect of war is unthinkable, not in the realm of the possible. Pockets of peace do emerge. And so I think when it comes to the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, when it comes to the relationship of the United States and China, we have to keep trying to push things in a positive direction. We know from history that the default position in international politics is competition, is rivalry, and in some cases is armed rivalry. But we also know from history that when you work hard enough, you can overcome that inevitable feeling that things are slipping away. This is one of those moments, those historical inflection points, where I think we could go either way. We could see the 21st century slip toward geopolitical competition, deglobalization, and liberal populism, or we could look at the moment that we're in now and push the pendulum back in the right direction. At this point, I think it's too soon to tell which way we're going to be heading.
President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, just published a 7,000-word article in Foreign Affairs, and it's focusing on the future of the world and America's place in it. One of the lines of many is that the world is becoming more contested, and the United States cannot talk only with those who share its vision or values. And it made me wonder whether or not, as you sort of look at what Jake Sullivan is trying to communicate, is this a moment of realism where America is finally beginning to understand the limits of its power and capabilities, that is in fact going to begin talking with other players with which it may not get along in a different way? Because I haven't seen that as part of the Biden administration's direction, certainly not in the Trump administration, but wonder whether you think the limits on American power are finally beginning to shape the way we think about what we can do in the world.
Well, I would start by quoting the first sentence in Jake's very interesting article, and that first sentence was, "Nothing in international politics is inevitable." And I would take issue with that analysis because I think some things are inevitable. Number one, change in the distribution of power, right? We go back to the 1700s and we saw power in the world shift from the east to the west. And Europe and North America together have been at the top of the heap, leading the pack for quite some time. We now see power beginning to shift from west to east and from north to south. That's going to make the world more difficult, more unpredictable, more uncertain. The United States is not going to be able to call the shots in the same way that it used to. We're going to have to get used to a multipolar world. We're going to have to get used to pluralism and ideological diversity because that's the world that we're headed toward. That seems to me to be inevitable. That having been said, I would agree with Jake that there's a lot of room for taming that world and channeling a more decentered world in a positive direction, but it will take working across geopolitical and ideological dividing lines. We now live, Steve, in a world that is more interdependent and globalized than ever before. Many of the challenges that we need to face, both as a country and as international citizens, require broad-based global cooperation. And that means working with countries with whom we may not share the same principles and the same values. I think the Biden administration got off to a more ideological start than was probably advisable. Democracy versus autocracy, with us or against us. Now I think it's realized that it needs a more pragmatic, a more practical approach. I do think that behind the scenes, the United States has been reaching out to China. We've seen a steady set of efforts of cabinet officials to head to China. Jake Sullivan has twice in the recent past met with the Chinese leadership. I think there's a sense that we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of a new Cold War. Let's see if we can't find ways of working with the Chinese to meet global challenges, even if we may disagree with them about human rights, about democracy, and even about geopolitical issues in East Asia.
Let me just ask you finally, in political science, we learn about, particularly in foreign policy, the continuity typically of policies from one administration to the next administration, regardless of political party. But it seems like that world is gone. And particularly when you look at a country like Iran, and if you were basically to say in your calculation that we should sit down and talk to Iran, we've had a zigzag in those policies. Do you think, as you look at the situation in America right now, which is part of that topsy-turvy dimension that you started with at the beginning, do you suspect that we're not going to have continuity in American foreign policy any longer, that we're going to continue to see zigzags and instability in the way we approach and engage the world?
Well, Steve, this zigzag and erratic statecraft that you're referring to is new. If you go back to the Cold War, really beginning with FDR, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Democrats and Republicans came together, and there was a broad, ideologically centrist bipartisan compact that stood behind a steady brand of American statecraft. Those days are gone, mainly because we've seen the hollowing out of the political center in the United States. And as a consequence, when power changes hands in Washington from Democrat to Republican, you get wild swings in foreign policy. I think that it is likely to continue depending upon who wins the next election, simply because there is a fundamental ideological cleavage along partisan lines about America's role in the world. For me, I think the key here is rebuilding the American political center from the ground up. Strength in the United States starts at home. And I think key to our future, both our domestic future and our ability to play a purposeful and effective international role, is rebuilding bipartisanship, rebuilding consensus. That is going to take getting working Americans back up on their feet.
Well, we'll have to end it there. Georgetown University professor Charles Kupchan, senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, thank you so much for joining us today.
Steve, it's been my pleasure to join you.
So what's the bottom line? Beneath all this analysis, global strategy and U.S. support for Israel and Ukraine, and Russia testing the West, and the role of non-state actors, beneath all of that are real people and real families. One of our colleagues here at Al Jazeera, the bureau chief in Gaza, just lost 4 members of his family after an Israeli airstrike hit what Israeli officials said was terrorist infrastructure. Wael Daghdou's family had already fled northern Gaza, as the Israelis had warned people to do, but they were killed anyway after fleeing south. This is real. Wael has lost most of his family, and there are thousands of other innocent people on both sides of this conflict who've lost their families this month. Yes, we should be thinking through policies and global crises and asking how we got here. But sometimes it's just time to give our sincere condolences to those who've just lost loved ones. And that's the bottom line.